light so I can do what I want with the shutter. Okay, so I'm going to go 1,000 in a second. Alright, I'm going to have Tuan model for me. Can you model for me?
Oh man. No, Susie.
Susie?
Get up
There
there,
you
bud.
go, Raquel. Students are
There we go.
Extra credit.
Yeah.
Alright, so right now I'm going to shoot at, let me crank up the ISO really high, 1600 for this camera. And then I'm going to open up the aperture, okay? Because right now we're talking about shutter, so I'm going to open up the aperture all the way on this camera, 2.8, okay?
So are you on what mode? Are you on
Okay, so do you
manual?
know, here, I'm going to put on TV mode.
TV?
TV on your camera means shutter priority, okay? For Nikon, it's SP,
I don't
okay?
think anybody in here has.
Any Nikons?
No.
Because we're charging more for Nikon users.
No.
Okay. I used to be a Nikon shooter too. It's just more convenient with Canon. However, I do like the color of Nikon a little bit better when you're doing portraits. It's a little bit more accurate to portraits. Canon tend to be a little bit more exaggerated with their colors. You know, green's always a little bit greener, red's always. Some people like that, but I'm more portrait, so I like Nikon portrait, and it looks a little bit sharper too, for whatever reason. Whether it's their technology, their sensors. Okay, so right now Raquel is. I'm gonna put it. So right now I'm on TV mode. I have my aperture. When you're on TV mode, whatever you change on the shutter, the aperture will automatically adjust to accommodate. Okay, so right now I'm not worried about aperture priority or the blurriness of the background. And then I have my ISO for this camera. This is my 5D. It's a pretty old camera. It's a full frame, but the maximum ISO is 1600, which is back then was a lot. Now it's like nothing. Okay, but that's plenty of light in here. Okay, so I'm going to shoot at 200 of a second first, just so you can see. Okay. Okay. So, all right. Lights off, John. Every time I push, you just put the light up. Okay. So here's Raquel standing there. Okay. With no, we shot it without a flash, just pretty straight lighting. So what Raquel's going to do is she's going to stand and she's going to wave her hand parallel to me. She's going to try to keep it as consistent as possible. Okay? So Raquel, one time. Okay. All right. So she's going to wave her hand. So at 200 of a second, she's pretty much frozen.
Yeah.
Her face is not moving, so that's always going to be sharp, regardless of what shutter speed I shoot at. But her hand is frozen at 200 a second. Now I'm going to drop my shutter to 1/25 of a second. She's going to do the same motion. Okay. If you look at her hand now, you have a slight blur factor. Okay, versus that. Right. Now I'm going to push it a little bit. Okay, even further.
But the first one was at what shutter?
Sure.
1000.
Yeah, so I'll show it to you.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. Okay, so the first one right here is at 200.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Oh,
And the aperture automatically adjusts to 3.5 to accommodate the light.
Okay.
Okay? Oh, the lack of light. The second one here, I shot at 1/25 of a second. But notice the aperture, because I dropped the shutter.
Yeah.
In other words, I shot slower, meaning I'm allowing more time for light. The aperture automatically closes to accommodate that. To always get the right amount of light for you. Okay? So when you change one number, then the other number always changes. Okay? So now you see a little bit more blur factor. Now I'm going to drop it to 60 of a second, and I can hold it pretty still. I used to shoot, when I shot film, I used to shoot into a 15th of a second. And a lot of people are like, you're crazy. All your pictures are going to be out of focus or blur. But it's not. Film's a little bit different. Film grains are circles. So when two circles are kind of slightly off, it's not as bad as pixels like squares. When two squares are slightly off, you really see that blur. You know what I mean? So we used to get away with a lot with film, with the shutter. Okay? Same motion, okay? You have to be the same speed. Alright, so here I'm shooting at a 60th of a second. And she's still pretty sharp, because I was able to hold the camera pretty still. But her hand right there is a little bit more blur. So it actually looked like she's waving instead of giving me a high five or just posing. Okay, so I'm going to drop it. I'm going to see how far I can push my hand and my subject. Okay? So I'm going to drop to 30th, which is one stop. 60th, 30th. So from 30th, 60, 125, every time it doubles up, we call that one stop. A lot of your cameras are great. They have in-between stops and stuff like that. Okay? Same motion, okay? Not faster, not slower. Same as you did before. I think you were a little bit fast. All right. So there, I'm shooting at 30th of a second. She is still pretty sharp. Okay, but watch. If I go down to a 15th, but her hand's really blurred. Okay, so if I go down to a 15th, you're gonna see right now that I might not be able to do it successfully. Okay, at a 15th of a second. I already, you know, I already felt my camera and my hand moving. Go ahead, John. Hey, not bad. Not bad. And that's that, you know, that attributes to how comfortable I am with my camera, but also my model being really still. But look at her hand. It's really, it's almost ghostly. Okay, let's push it even more. So I'm going down to maybe an 1/8 of a second. Okay. And right now my aperture is closed all the way now because it's telling me that an 1/8 of a second is closing the 22. I mean, it's too much light, so it's closing the aperture to accommodate for it. Okay. I'm pretty good. She's still pretty sharp. But look at her hand. It's starting to disappear. Okay? Now here's a question for you. Just get you thinking. Now let's say I want to shoot at an 1/8 of a second, for whatever reason. But my aperture is a 16th of a second, and I don't want that. Because look at the 16th. Look at the background. It's too sharp. I don't like that. I don't like that background being that sharp. I want to blur that background out. I want my aperture to drop, to open up more. But the problem is everything's going to be too bright. What can I change? My ISO. Okay?
What can you change?
Yeah.
ISO.
I can change my ISO. I can tell the camera to be less sensitive. Don't be so sensitive.
Uh-huh.
You know, be less sensitive. So if I change right now let me change my aperture to, let me go to my ISO on this camera. Let me see, ISO on this camera's top. You guys can't see that now. Okay, I'm going to go to my ISO 500, okay? So, lights off, John? That's automatically going to open up my aperture now, okay? Lights on, John? Sorry. Okay. Still shooting at an 1/8 of a second. That opened up my aperture to 10. Instead it was 16 earlier. The background is a little bit more blurred out. Okay? So I'm going to go to my ISO. I'm going to tell my ISO even be less sensitive. I'm going to go 200. Okay? Lights on? Okay. So that one, the ISO opened up to 6.3. See the background starting to blur out a little bit more? See my grandma's picture? You can't really see her anymore? Versus if I go back to, to 16 or 22, I had 16 earlier. There we go. Oh, sorry, my bad. Go to 16. There we go. It's a little bit sharper. The background's a little bit sharper. So that takes us to the aperture. When we choose an aperture, we're choosing what we call depth of field. Okay? Do we want everything from foreground, background, and midground to be sharp? Or do we want that blur factor? Okay? So I'm going to move on to the next part. Okay, so everybody kind of understand the shutter a little bit?
So if you want to blur the background, you increase the aperture?
No,
No,
you
bring
open
it
up the
down.
aperture. Yeah, you increase it by opening it up. But in the aperture world, the numbers are smaller when the aperture is larger.
Wait, so then just now when you changed the ISO, that allowed the background to be blurred.
When I
So
changed
the
that-
lower the lower the
Yes.
the ISO.
So what I do is when I lower the ISO, it forces the camera to open up the aperture larger.
Okay.
Because I'm telling the camera, don't be so sensitive to light. But the camera's telling me, okay, if I'm not going to be sensitive to light, I need to open up your aperture larger because there's not enough light. So it automatically, because that's a semi-automatic mode. Okay, so it opens up the aperture larger. So when the aperture's opened up larger, the background blurs out more.
I thought that it so that when the lower the number, so like 2 gives you blurry, and then but 10 gives you
Sharper.
crisp.
Yeah,
Correct.
a little bit
So
sharper.
that means the 2 is a bigger aperture.
Bigger aperture, you got it.
Oh.
Yeah. So earlier when we shot with 1600, it was on 16 aperture. So when we told the camera sensor to be less sensitive, it started to open up more. It went down to 8. You know, if I keep going, it'll go down to 5.6. If I shoot at 2.8, background will be really blurry.
Uh-huh.
Okay, my mom's not so.
Okay.
Okay, so when you think about motion, okay, I'm gonna take this picture of this person waving. Do I want to look like they're giving me a high five, or do I really want it to give the effect that they're actually waving? Okay, because the one with the hand blur and the face sharp